morning, Good morning, DawgNation. I'm Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp. Happy to have you with us. Fun show for us. It's Terrence Edwards on a Thursday. A lot of hype out there for one of the Georgia players, starting to generate a good bit of draft buzz for the upcoming season. That's also perhaps going to be showcased on the field this fall. We're going to talk about that. And the comparison that doesn't seem to go away between Georgia and Ohio State. Some very interesting things being said about that. And I think it provides a little bit of a framework for what Georgia's pursuit of a national championship is going to look like. So we're going to talk about that there as well. A lot to do. Glad to have you with us as we do it all. It is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans, presented today by Merriweather and Tharp. And it begins right now.
Today's episode of DawgNation Daily is brought to you by Merriweather and Tharp, your source for Georgia divorce. Find them online at georgiadivorceteam.com.
Presented by DawgNation.com, this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. Here's your host, Brandon Adams.
All right, coming up in a few minutes, I'm going to say something about the outlook for a Georgia player this year, my very high expectations for that player, that admittedly are probably a little unfair. In other words, I'm probably asking more than I have a right to ask. Almost certainly I am. And yet it still sort of feels like it's coming from a genuine and authentic place in me that maybe it's a possibility. When I explain this to you in a couple of minutes, I think it's going to make more sense. We'll get to that here coming up in a moment. A lot of talk about one player in particular as we move a little closer to the 2024 season. Prior to that, though, I want to look at this here for a moment. And I thought that Connor Riley had an interesting piece at DawgNation.com the other day looking at one of these analytics type deals, advanced stats type deals. And I totally get some of the math nerd stuff is not everybody's cup of tea. You're well within your right to disregard all of it if you would like. But it does create a little bit of an interesting talking point. You know, one of the things that we see are these ratings, like Bill Connelly from ESPN.com does a version of this. It's called SP+. And what it's basically sort of built around is the idea of how successful your plays are, both as an offense, advancing the football, as a defense, preventing that from happening. When you hear the word efficiency used in football, a lot of times your analytics rating like an SP+ is kind of based on how efficient you are, how successful you are based on like the down and distance. In other words, it's way better to get 10 yards on 3rd and 5 than it is to get 10 yards on 3rd and 30. We all kind of understand that. And that, in some respects, is what these analytics rating services sort of take into account on a per-play basis. How successful are you as an offense, as a defense, as a team in general? It is perhaps not surprising to you to find out that using these kinds of numbers, Georgia begins the year, and a lot of this is also the formula of what you bring back, your returning talent, your returning production, your recruiting success, all of the full picture of what makes a team. Probably not a surprise to you to find out that Georgia is number one in this analytics-minded SP+ rating for the upcoming season. And yet it's still interesting to see just how wide the gap is between Georgia and anyone else. In fact, let me read this to you. Connor Riley, DawgNation.com, kind of chronicling what Bill Connelly said at ESPN.com about where Georgia falls in his SP+ rating system. Do we have this? Yeah, here we go. So this is what Connor writes. There's some debate about who the top team in college football is at this point in time. And by the way, we've seen that, right? We've seen Joel Klatt tout Ohio State. We've seen ESPN tout Georgia. I'm talking about in their updated top 25 that came out a few days ago. We've seen a handful of people kind of picking either Georgia or Ohio State. But as Connor goes on to say, there's still a handful of national writers. They've got Georgia in the number one spot, equal support for Ohio State as well. Texas and Oregon are lingering. But, Connor says, in ESPN's updated SP+ rankings, which factor in returning production, recruiting rankings, recent history into the metric, the Bulldogs are clearly the number one team. Now, listen to this. This is fascinating. Connor reports about this SP+ ranking that Georgia comes in at number one in Bill Connelly's system with a value of 36.3. Now, what does 36.3 mean in this particular case? I have no idea, but that's the number attached to Georgia. A value of 36.3. Ohio State is number two at 32.7. That gap of 3.6 is the same as between Ohio State and the number 5 team in the ranking, Alabama. So what Connor's describing there at least statistically from kind of the math nerd point of view, there is a fairly significant gap between Georgia and Ohio State, with the advantage going to the Bulldogs there on that, which maybe your eyes would tell you to agree with, maybe they wouldn't, but it's kind of an interesting analytics look at kind of what the tail of the tape is between Georgia and Ohio State right now. And, of course, we'll see if it actually plays out that way on the field later on this fall. But the other part of this that I find to be so fascinating is because while the statistical tail of the tape may favor Georgia, boy, it seems like the talking head and the talking season time of year that we're in, it seems like it's a lot easier to find like wild, over-the-top praise for Ohio State than it is to kind of find the same thing as it relates to Georgia. And what we're about to get into here for a moment, I want you to understand kind of where I'm coming from, and I don't want you to hear what I'm not saying. This is not going to be one of those, can you believe they're praising Ohio State and they're anti-Georgia and we ought to be mad about this? I'm honestly not telling you to be mad about this, and I can say, with full confidence, I'm not mad about this. But I do find it to be curious. And, it's one of those things I knew I wanted to talk about this, but it kind of took me a second to sort of figure out what it was that I actually wanted to say, what all this means. And I think I've actually kind of arrived at a conclusion on this that's more valuable than just the sort of knee-jerk surface reaction of too much praise for Ohio State coming at the expense of Georgia. And as we pointed out before, we did some of that a year ago as it related to, like, say, Michigan and Alabama. And as it turned out, we're kind of wrong. So we want to be careful not to get it wrong in that same way again here this year. So are we clear on all that? Okay, so now let's get into more of what I want to discuss, because while it is true that Georgia may have the analytics edge, the SP plus rating edge over Ohio State, and that margin may be a fairly wide one, that does not stop certain media types from continuing to be very impressed with Ohio State overall. In fact, the other day, we were kind of talking about one of those ESPN kind of preseason sort of scene setter type articles. Here's a lot to be excited about for the upcoming season. Well, recently CBS Sports did their own version of that with 100 days to come before the start of the season, all the big storylines and things like that. And one of the storylines that the CBS writer, in this case I believe it's Chip Patterson, one of the storylines they fixated on is perhaps not a surprise, Ohio State, but nonetheless, what CBS said about the Buckeyes, I found to be really interesting. One word, one description in particular that the writer Chip Patterson used to describe Ohio State's fascinating. I want to show you this on the screen here for a moment. Chip Patterson calls them the rockstar Buckeyes. And he goes on to say, speaking of our coach rankings, right behind Kirby Smart was Ohio State's Ryan Day, who checked in one spot ahead of two-time national championship-winning coach Dabo Swinney. Day, who has 3 college football playoff appearances and 5 top 10 finishes in 5 seasons, the Buckeyes coach is entering 2024 with more pressure than ever that's ever been put on a coach who's won 56 of his first 64 games. The CBS writer goes on to say the pressure is coming in the wake of 3 straight losses to Michigan, but also from an offseason that saw Ohio State stack its depth chart with roster retention of potential pros and much coveted additions from the transfer portal. Let's show the next one here. The CBS writer goes on to say, a half dozen players who were draft eligible elected to return, and combined with star-studded portal additions like Caleb Downs from Alabama and Quinshon Judkins from Ole Miss, Ohio State has built a team that could challenge Georgia for the NFL draft record in 2025. There are players who'll be wearing scarlet and gray on Saturdays that absolutely could have been playing on Sundays this fall. And that talent advantage is why Ohio State is the only non-Georgia option for the number 1 team in the land heading into the year. It's as, listen to this now, this is CBS on Ohio State. It's as close to a super team as we see in college football, complete with not just rock star roster, but a high-profile staff that was bolstered by Chip Kelly, leaving UCLA to come, blah, 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 blah. So there you go. This year, as Georgia tries to pursue another national championship, it's got a group of rock stars standing in the way. And listen, as I said before, it's not necessarily my intention to be like, why are they giving all this love to Ohio State and not showing enough love to Georgia? But I am genuinely curious, like, why are the Buckeyes kind of viewed to be more, and I'm using air quotes here, more rock star-ish than Georgia is? I mean, is it because of Quinshon Judkins? And listen, Judkins is a very good player. But Judkins came into Athens this past fall for Ole Miss. I believe he had a touchdown that day. And he's a very good player. But at any point in time, if you were there at that game, or you're like, oh, my gosh, there's a rock star on the field. Quinshon Judkins, what's he going to do next? No, he's just a good player, good running back. But Georgia's had good running backs plenty of times. And Caleb Downs, no doubt about it, Georgia wanted Caleb Downs. That's not in dispute. And yet he goes to Ohio State. He's a great safety. But Georgia always has a great safety, always a player in contention to be the best safety in the country. In fact, Malachi Starks is that right now. Like, having a big-time safety transfer and a big-time running back transfer, with all due respect, doesn't exactly feel like it's like rock star status for the Buckeyes necessarily, at least not in my mind. Now, Jeremiah Smith, the incoming freshman wide receiver, he's probably a rock star. I would certainly acknowledge that. But is that enough to make like the whole team rock stars? And is like Chip Kelly becoming offensive coordinator, is that big of a deal? Ryan Day was already a pretty good play caller. And as said before, it's not something to be mad about, but I do think it's something to kind of generate some curiosity over. Like, Chip Patterson says, Ohio State may challenge Georgia's record for most draft picks ever. Well, guess what? Georgia may also challenge Georgia's record for most draft picks ever. Why does that in and of itself make Ohio State more of a rock star team when Georgia perhaps could do the same thing? And some of this sort of feels like a topic we've addressed before. Do you remember the other day, the national radio host Colin Cowherd? Many of you don't like him, and you're well within your right not to. But do you remember when he was talking about Carson Beck the other day after they sort of stumbled and bumbled and finally remembered what his name was? And he was kind of dismissed as somehow not worthy of a top 5 pick for reasons that still don't quite seem to make sense to me. This idea that somehow Ohio State is a group of rock stars in a way that Georgia isn't sort of feels like some of the stuff that Colin Cowherd and his guest, Nick Wright, were talking about on FS1, or it was actually the Colin Cowherd podcast the other day. Let me give you a little bit of a reminder of what was said then, because I think it kind of fits into this same discussion about what Georgia is, what Georgia isn't, and just the fascination that people have with this so-called rock star team over at Ohio State. This is Colin Cowherd.
Shedeur Sanders, the kid Cam Ward at Miami, who's pretty interesting. There's a kid Notre Dame got a transfer who's pretty interesting.
No, and Quinn Ewers, people like him, and then there's one more that we're forgetting. That's the guy who's most likely to go number 1. I talked about it on the show today, so see if I can remember it. But I was just about to look like, hold on a second. Oh, Carson Beck is the other one, the kid from Georgia that people something. Yeah.
I don't think he's a top 5 pick. I think he's He's Georgia good.
I think you're probably right.
I still don't know what that means. And I love the fact that Nick Wright sort of immediately acts like he knows what Colin Cowherd means by he's Georgia good. He's not rock star good, but he's Georgia good. And some of this sometimes sort of feels like that Georgia's dominance just isn't all that interesting to the average media member. And once again, I'm not trying to be like, you got to be mad about that. You're not getting enough love. That's not what I'm saying. But I do find it fascinating because it seems to happen on such a consistent basis. That so-and-so's a rock star, but so-and-so for Georgia, well, he's just Georgia good, but we know that doesn't count. We're more interested in what somebody else does, something like that. And so what I wanted to do is kind of take this to a place of trying to figure out, like, what is this about and what does this mean? And I do think I've kind of come up with a little bit of an explanation of what I think is going on here for why Ohio State gets to be rock stars and Georgia gets to be just the team that's the best, but not really all that interesting in the eyes of the media. Here's one thing it comes down to, is that the so-called rock star status that a team like Ohio State has earned sort of feels like it was born out of the fact that they have legitimately won the offseason. No doubt there's been more headlines, more big wow moments for Ohio State than any other team this offseason. Winning the sweepstakes for Caleb Downs was a big deal. Getting a guy like Quinshon Judkins was a pretty big deal. And it's a name that people know because he played in the SEC. It is certainly a very big headline. And Chip Kelly coming to Ohio State after having been UCLA head coach, that's a big headline. And I think when the media says, oh, man, these rock star Buckeyes, what are they going to do? I think the unspoken subtext to that is, are they going to continue to make headlines on the field the way they've dominated headlines off the field? Because the media likes headlines because the media is in the headline business. So therefore, there's always going to be a little bit of an affection for a program that's good at generating headlines because that's just good for the overall bottom line of the media that covers college football. It's just sort of basic incentivized behavior. But by comparison, Georgia has not made as many headlines this offseason. But those of us who are close to Georgia, I think we would say it has been a very good offseason for UGA. And that's where I think things get interesting, is that the kind of success that Georgia has enjoyed this offseason is not the kind of success that generates headlines, but it is no less valuable. And this is important. There was a piece in The Athletic last few days. I think Manny Navarro, I believe, is the guy that wrote it. It's kind of like one of these sort of like transfer portal confidentials or NIL confidentials, the sort of anonymous sources telling you what's going on in the NIL space. And one of the things that a lot of the people in the story quoted anonymously are saying is one of the big things that NIL is currently being used for is player retention. That we may see a bunch of headlines about so-and-so school going out and grabbing so-and-so player, but the lion's share of the dollars we're led to believe by some of these reports right now is actually for so-and-so school keeping so-and-so player in its program. And we maybe see examples of that all across college football, but we definitely see examples of that at Georgia. Now, we don't know for sure how much NIL played a role in that, but we can certainly guess. So when Julian Humphrey doesn't transfer, doesn't generate a headline, but that's a big deal for Georgia. When Daniel Harris doesn't transfer, that doesn't generate a headline, but it's a big deal for Georgia. When Christian Miller this spring, when he doesn't transfer, that doesn't make national news, but it's a big deal for Georgia. And I think that's what's going on here is both Ohio State and Georgia have had good off seasons. Both Ohio State and Georgia are legitimate national championship contenders. Don't take this conversation me saying there's no way Ohio State can win the national championship. Of course this program could. This is a real threat to Georgia. But why does Ohio State generate more talk than Georgia does? It's because Ohio State has done the kinds of things that generate more headlines. They've gone out and taken players off someone else's roster. The media just naturally thinks that's more interesting. Georgia, though, has done work to keep its roster together. That doesn't generate headlines. People in Seattle or Chicago or L.A., they don't even know that happened. But it did happen, and it was a big deal. Who is the better roster overall? The ESPN analytics dude says it's Georgia, at least right now. Will that be played out this fall? We'll find out. But Georgia quietly keeping its team together could end up being a bigger deal than Ohio State, very loudly and noisily going out and taking players off somebody else's roster. That may earn the Buckeyes rock star status, but the real stars of the fall yet to be determined. And we think that Georgia's in a very good spot for all of that. My name's Brandon Adams, and this is DawgNation Daily, the daily podcast for Georgia Bulldogs fans. We're presented by Merriweather and Tharp, and we're glad to have you with us no matter how you get to us today. We're live on video, 10 a.m. across all platforms, radio, Athens Sports Radio 960 The Ref, podcast, wherever you find them. But by the way, speaking of that, if you elect to listen to the show or maybe you watch on video and sometimes you want to, kind of go back and get some of the show that you missed, one of the best ways to do that is to check us out there on podcast. And that's Spotify, that's Apple. You can go subscribe to the show so that it shows up for you if you miss. If you're normally a video viewer, or maybe you check it out at DawgNation.com, if you've gotten used to listening to the show, we post it at DawgNation.com. And of course, we love having that there for you. Getting it dropped right when it shows up on your feed may even be more convenient for you. So let me encourage you, if you've never done this before, subscribe to the show on Apple, subscribe to the show on Spotify. Many of you now subscribing on YouTube too, which is becoming a podcast platform there as well. That's interesting. We just appreciate you being a part of what we're doing here. Also, huge thanks to our friends at Merriweather and Tharp who make it all possible there as well. Your source for Georgia divorce. And divorce is tough, right? And Merriweather and Tharp has kind of dedicated their lives to serving people during this tough time of need. And they've heard stories, they've listened to their clients, and they're shaping their service now to reflect the stories that they're hearing on a regular basis. And one of those is kind of around the cost, right? There is obviously some cost associated with going through divorce. And when people kind of find themselves in that confusing set of circumstances, one of the things that our friends at Merriweather and Tharp have heard on a regular basis is that desire for some cost certainty of, we know it's going to cost something, but what is it going to cost me? And that's where Merriweather and Tharp has kind of tailored several levels of service or options for service to kind of fit whatever you think your specific circumstances are. In other words, if you kind of feel like your situation, is relatively uncomplicated, then you might like a DIY level of service, which at Meriwether and Tharp can be had for as little as $99. Or if you feel like you've got some unique circumstances that make your situation more complicated, well, the kind of traditional service that Meriwether and Tharp has been providing for years, maybe that's the best thing for you. Or perhaps for you, it's kind of something in between all of that. One of the things they've introduced is their model M&T level of service, where you can pay for your divorce process with a flat rate right up front or as a subscription service on a per-month basis while your divorce process is still ongoing. It's a really creative idea. It's something that Meriwether and Tharp has brought to the marketplace, and the response to this has been great here thus far. So I want you to find out more about this by checking out GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. That's the website, GeorgiaDivorceTeam.com. Meriwether and Tharp is your source for Georgia divorce. All right, we've got Terrence Edwards here coming up in a moment. I'm also going to update you on the huge giveaway we're doing right now for the big game for Georgia for the upcoming fall, the biggest of them all. We'll do that here coming up in just a little bit. Prior to that, though, let's go around the doghouse. And I started today's show by saying that I feel like I'm on the verge of asking something unfair from one of Georgia's seeming top emerging playmakers for the upcoming fall. And even though that I'm willing to acknowledge right here at the forefront, it's probably a little unfair, I still kind of find myself saying, yeah, but maybe it's still possible. Let me show you the genesis for all of this. I saw this on the X platform the other day, the folks from Pro Football Focus showing some love for Georgia now edge rusher, I guess we'll call him, Mykel Williams. Going to play a lot more outside linebacker this year after having been the defensive end in the past. And the folks at PFF had something interesting to say about Mykel and kind of exactly maybe where he's projecting here right now. I think we might have this to show. Yeah. So what Max Chadwick writes is that Mykel Williams shares many similarities to another former Georgia Bulldog, 2022 first overall pick, Travon Walker. And the caption said, Mykel Williams is next up for Georgia. Now, normally that would be enough, and frankly, it probably should be enough. And frankly, in and of itself, that ought to be a headline. Mykel Williams draws favorable comparison to former number 1 overall pick. Sounds great, right? But here's where the unfair part kind of comes in for me, and I can't help but feel this way. Travon Walker was an outstanding player at Georgia. Travon Walker was just a bedrock piece of a national championship defense. And yet, I sort of want Mykel to have a better year for Georgia this year than the eventual number 1 overall pick Travon Walker had for Georgia in 2021. And I know that's unfair. That is so obscene to ask from a player, hey, I need you to be better than the guy that 2 years ago became the number 1 overall pick. I need you to be better than that this year. But I do believe it's a possibility because for as good as Travon Walker was, that didn't always show up on the stat sheet. Not because of anything that Walker did wrong. It's just because of the way that Georgia kind of asked him to fit into its overall defense. And to Georgia's credit, even without big stats, it still propelled Walker to the number 1 overall draft pick status. But I do believe the best version of Georgia here this year means sort of a bigger overall stat line from a guy like Mykel, because being a little more dynamic defensively for Georgia this year seems pretty important given what we didn't see from Georgia a year ago. And every now and then this kind of stuff sort of pops up on the internet. Kirby Smart will do these like coaching clinics, and the stuff that you get from Kirby during a coaching clinic is always so much more interesting than just regular media stuff because Kirby likes coaches. I think he likes coaching coaches. And there's one of these that popped up the other day. The best I can tell, this is from 2021 because Kirby's doing it virtually. He kind of references the 2021 team. It sort of feels like this is from 2021. And he made a point. It's obviously not about Mykel Williams. We were well ahead of Mykel Williams at this point. But it kind of reminded me of Mykel Williams because one of the things that Kirby Smart kind of talked about was the way in which offenses try to get their playmakers involved, that at Georgia they kind of want to do a version of that there as well to make sure their defensive playmakers get involved. And the mindset that Kirby shared in this particular coaching clinic clip, I do think is relevant for how perhaps Mykel Williams could be used this year. So this is from a coaching clinic. It's an audio clip of a video that kind of popped up online. Kirby kind of sharing a little bit of his overarching defensive philosophy. And as you listen to this, see if you don't think this couldn't be a little bit of an explanation for how a guy like Mykel Williams could thrive this fall. Here's Kirby.
We want to talk players over plays. Remember, offenses have done an elite job of evolving. They know what most defenses do. So we've now gone to say, you know what? This game is not really about running the same play every year. It's about making sure what your guys do best, you're putting them in position to do. All right, so players over plays. Offenses do it, why not us? OCs make sure their playmakers get touches. We want to do the same on defense. And we're not talking about touches. We're talking about do what your team does best. Do what your strength is.
So I love that. He says, listen, if you're an offense, it's always been players over plays. What can we do to get so-and-so player involved? Why wouldn't we ask the same thing on defense? And in that particular clip, he was talking about, blitzing inside linebackers because that's what guys like Nakobe Dean and Quay Walker were so good at, so they wanted to do that a lot. Well, this year, doesn't it seem like turning a guy like Mykel Williams loose would be an example of that? So, admittedly, it's unfair for me to say, hey, Mykel, go out and put bigger stats and have a bigger year than the eventual number 1 overall pick Trayvon Walker had for Georgia in 2021. But also, when you see the talent level of Mykel Williams, it's not impossible to think that he couldn't do that. And if he does get unleashed the way that Kirby Smart's describing there, what a thing that could be for the Georgia defense. And that is Around the Doghouse here on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp today. All right, I am late. I want to get Terrence Edwards here, and I apologize for keeping him waiting. But let me also squeeze this in before we do. As I told you before, yesterday we unleashed a huge announcement here for DawgNation. The biggest game of the upcoming season, and one of the biggest regular season games Georgia's ever played, takes place this October in Austin, Texas. And our friends from ATL Sports Trips, partnering with DawgNation, they want you to have a chance to be there for this incredible giveaway. It includes a 2-night hotel stay right there in Austin. It's 2 passes to our Friday night football party. DawgNation going to be a big part of that. It's a huge DawgNation Invasion event. And then, of course, 2 tickets to the tailgate there on Saturday with the food and the beverage and all that goes along with that. And as well, 2 tickets to the game. You can be right there in the stadium in Austin for the big game this upcoming fall in October. You have your chance to win. In fact, registration is open right now, going to remain so until June 5th. It's a DawgNation Invasion to Austin. You could win your way there with tickets to the game, tickets to the tailgate, 2 nights hotel, tickets to the Friday night football party. You can get all of that if you are the winner. So register for your chance today. Go to DawgNation.com/tailgate for more on that. It's DawgNation.com/tailgate to get registered for your chance to win today. Do so between now and June the 5th. Huge, huge giveaway as we get ready to invade Austin this upcoming fall. Going to be a great time. Speaking of great times, always great to have the former Georgia wide receiver Terrence Edwards on the program. So let's do that right now here today on DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp.
From Athens and across the SEC or wherever the recruiting trail may lead, here's a DawgNation.com insider.
All right, I want to jump right into this because I've kept him waiting too long. Terrence, a lot of buzz out there from Mykel Williams. We were just talking about that. And I said, listen, blowhard, loudmouth like me, unfair to say maybe even a bigger year than what Trayvon Walker did in 2021. We know Walker became the eventual number 1 pick. But I do see the talent. I do see the potential to have that kind of unleashed. Now standing up as kind of an outside linebacker. I do get really excited to think about from a statistical standpoint what a guy like Williams can do. We don't always see the Georgia pass rushers put up the big statistical numbers, but I think for a guy like Mykel, it's going to at least be considered as a possibility, right, ahead of what could be a major kind of dress rehearsal for next year's NFL draft. Is that fair?
I think so. I think both players are very similar in height, size, and ability. I think Mykel might bring a little bit more pass rush from the outside than we saw from the other guy. So I'm looking for Mykel to pick up bigger stacks than Trayvon Walker because we know the production of the stacks didn't come, but he played within the scheme of the defense. And I think that's one of the knocks on Trayvon Walker coming out is how can the number 1 guy only put up 3, 4, 5 stacks when other guys are putting that double figure. So I think you can see Mykel getting up there 8, 9, 10 because of his pass ability.
Yeah, it's also to me kind of the one area in which we kind of haven't fully seen the Georgia defense maybe maximize its potential. Georgia's had, the best defensive lineman in America. It's had the best inside linebackers in America. It's had the best cornerback before. Frequently has the best safety. In terms of really kind of unleashing the outside linebacker, Nolan Smith did become a number 1 overall pick in after the 2022 season, but he spent a good bit of that year injured. Didn't have the big numbers. Azeez Ojulari had a great year for Georgia in 2020, so perhaps that's the high water mark in terms of on-field production here thus far in the Kirby Smart era. But one of the things that I do think could be fun about this upcoming season is kind of seeing that edge rush position, the stand-up, outside linebacker, seeing that position perhaps this upcoming year because of Damon Wilson, because of Mykel Williams, because of guys who are still there, see that position maybe have more success this year than any point in time in this recent era there for UGA. Be fun to see that whole group be turned loose, I believe.
Most definitely. I'm just sitting here thinking about why you're asking the question, like, who has been that dominant pass rusher from the edge? And I can tell you, just imagine if Adam Anderson didn't get into the legal trouble that he got into. I just think he had the ability to bend the corner. And I think we have some guys that fit that mold right now that could really bend and get to the edge and just have that dominant pass rusher like Willie Allison from Alabama. I'm still looking for that type guy that just dominates the edge. And Adam Anderson was one of those guys I thought was, for the slight of playing time that he got, he dominated on the edge. And we need that type pass rusher where offensive line and offense have to scheme around the pass rusher.
Well, speaking of domination, one of your proteges had a big night this past weekend as CJ Wiley had 2 touchdowns in his spring game there for Milton after a big statistical year a year ago. But it seems like, Terrence, and you and I briefly talked about this a little earlier this week, but it seems like there's a conversation happening around Wiley that has really picked up a lot of steam as of late, where it becomes a realistic possibility that could be a 5-star and frankly, in contention to be the best receiver in the whole sport here right now before this 2025 cycle comes to a close. What do you make of just the kind of buzz that sort of exists around CJ Wiley here right now?
Yes, and I want this to go out and people to tag CJ. He owed me 250 push-ups because the first play of the game, he had an opportunity to make a big play, and he didn't make it. The guy made a good play. He popped it out. So when I FaceTimed him after the game, I don't want to talk about the 2 touchdowns. That's expected. I expect you to make that play. And I told him he owed me 250, and I haven't got him yet, but I'm still going to get my 250 push-ups. But I know the type of player that he is. He's going to get on the Judge machine and catch 250 passes when he get opportunity. The family is that way. So I think what sets him apart is his work ethic, man. I mean, just when we had coaches meeting last year on Sundays at Milton, he would be out there with his mom and dad on the Judge machine, getting 500 catches off the Judge machine. So it's his work ethic that just sets him apart and why I think he is a 5-star talent. And I was really shocked to where a lot of prosecutors had him ranked, but I think he will be properly ranked for this upcoming season.
Yeah, I mean, it's amazing to me, as you described, when you have the athleticism, and obviously Wiley possesses that, and you put that with the work ethic, especially this receiver position where, so much of this is how polished you're able to play, it becomes kind of an unbeatable combination, right?
Right, most definitely. He has that. I mean, you just look at what he did in track this year. I think his 100 time was 11-1, I think, starting the season. And he finished the season at a 10-8 at 6'4", almost 200 pounds. So he's just not sitting there resting on his laurels about I'm the best receiver. No, he's still going out there and putting in the work to be even better. So that what sets him apart is just his unique work ethic. And I just think that comes from his family bloodline, with his father being a NFL player and the LSU. Coming from LSU, and his mother was an athlete as well. Now, he has a sister that plays volleyball at Georgia Tech. So that the work ethic is set from his parents.
Yeah, and so along those lines, and listen, I know you're going to support your guys, and it's not just CJ Wiley. You got a lot of guys, and we'll talk about another one here in a moment, but you're going to support your guys no matter what. But obviously, Georgia fans are curious about how this recruitment's going to play out. We know that LSU, has been great at getting big-time receivers for a long time. They also just have a spot open up because they recently had a high-profile decommitment. You get the family tie to LSU here. Like, what do you think when you see Georgia kind of battling with a program like LSU, among others, that have a history of going out and getting the big-time receivers, it sounds like this recruitment could get really interesting before it's all said and done.
Yeah, that just lets you know that now that Georgia can go into these homes and talk to the elite receivers. Now, not just CJ Wiley in the state. We're lucky enough to have Travis Smith also in the state of Georgia. So 2 receivers that Georgia is very high on, and a black shear down in Savannah. So there's a lot of talent here in the state that Georgia can put all their resources into. Let's lock down these 3 receivers in the state of Georgia, then kind of go outside the state, because those are really 3 good receivers. Then in the 26th class, you have Ryan Mosley out of Carrollton.
Yeah.
You have Aaron Gregory out of Douglas, and you have another one of my proteges, Devin Carter, out of Cedar Grove. So the state is rich with wide receiver talent. And I think that's been a big topic. I think Jeff Santella and I had this conversation about the talent just haven't been there like that in the state of Georgia, but it's here now. We have it's really deep in the next 2 classes.
Well, with that in mind, let's transition to Travis Smith here for a moment, because, and I want to start with what you just said. Obviously, we see what looks to be a little bit of a renewed emphasis for Georgia on wide receiver recruiting, and what a great time. I should say high school wide receiver recruiting. They've gone out and done very well in the transfer portal the last couple of years, and it seems like they're kind of renewing their emphasis on high school wide receiver recruiting here right now. And what a great time for Georgia, knowing it's going to need receivers, to have the state be so talent-rich here right now. And, obviously everything sort of feels like a must-win when it comes to a recruiting situation. But, Terrence, and you just rattle off the names, and a lot of these guys very, very well. When you have this level of talent, both class of 2025 and 26 here in Georgia, UGA winning with some of these prospects, the lion's share of these prospects, to me, that's a very important storyline for Georgia for the next 2 cycles, I believe.
I think so. I think it's very important that, that Georgia kind of put their focus on these in-state guys, because they're very, very talented. And I think, staying in state, getting these guys also lets the younger generation know that if you put in the work, and along with God getting talent, that Georgia will come knocking. They just won't go out of state to Florida or California or Texas to go get a receiver. They'll stay right here, because we do have, I think, the greatest high school football in America. So with Aaron Gregory in the 26th class, Devin Carter in the 26th class, Ryan Mosley in the 26th class, along with the others that we spoke about in the 25 class, Georgia has a abundance of riches as in the wide receiver position here in the state of Georgia.
Did Travis tell you anything about the scavenger hunt? It certainly seems like everybody's having a good time there for that. Georgia seems to do a really good job with these events. Any word from him on having a good time on campus this past weekend?
Yes, I spoke to his dad this weekend. They had a great time. So the scavenger hunt was a big hit. Georgia has really, have made Travis a priority, and I think Travis understands he's a priority. So now we just figure out, I think he set a commitment date coming up the 13th, if I'm not mistaken, July 13th, if I'm not mistaken.
I think so. Yeah.
It's at the thick of things, but we know if it's not Georgia I don't know, we know Kirby and Company is not going to give up until he signs on the dotted line.
For sure.
So this is probably going to be one of those battles that go to the end, if not. But I'm interested to see as well. I can't wait to see where he goes, because he's a talented young man.
Let me finish with this. I was talking before you joined the show about this perception out there that Ohio State's more interesting than Georgia, that they're the rock stars of college football because of the high-profile transfers and all that kind of stuff. Like, when you look at Ohio State, I don't know how much you've gotten a chance to sort of pay attention to the offseason they've had, bringing in Caleb Downs and bringing in Quinshon Judkins from Ole Miss. Obviously, Jeremiah Smith, we do think he probably is a rock star. That's probably a fair description for what he's going to have a chance to be here this year. But what do you make about all of the energy and attention that Ohio State is kind of drawing thus far this offseason?
Yes, they have brought in high-profile players, the players that you name, and I think Jeremiah Smith, since I've been kind of studying this position, especially from the high school standpoint, I think he's the best receiver that I've seen coming out of high school since AJ Green and Julio Jones. But with that being said, they could be rock stars all they want. Kirby Smart has the hardware to prove he's a rock star.
No, that's great, Terrence. I think that's outstanding, and I certainly appreciate that. I think that's very well said. And Obviously, we talk about, you're working with guys like CJ Wiley and Travis Smith, this great collection of receivers. And for that next generation of guys who are maybe just getting ready to get their high school career started, who want to have the success that guys like this are currently enjoying, obviously the Terrence Edwards Wide Receiver Academy is a great way to get all that done. How can folks find you online, Terrence?
Yes, if you want to, just like CJ and Travis and Devin Carter and Ryan Moser, all those guys started with me in middle school. So I'm looking for definitely middle school receivers who looking to be trained the right way. You can find me on all social media platforms at Terrence Edwards Wide Receiver Academy.
Terrence, I appreciate that. You were also kind enough to join us for something we're going to play for the folks next week, giving us a lot of your time here this week. Thank you so much for that. We'll look forward to catching up with you here live a couple of weeks from now. So appreciate that, and have a great Memorial Day weekend here coming up.
As you can see, I'm in my office now. Go Stains.
I like it. I love it, Terrence. Good stuff. We'll talk to you soon.
Thank you.
Let's take a look around the rest of the league. This is SEC Through.
Yeah, good stuff, Terrence Edwards. So I'll tell you this real quick. As many of you know, tomorrow a little bit of a getaway day for us. So our last live show is going to be tomorrow. Memorial Day, Monday. There's a small handful of days we don't typically do a show. Memorial Day is one of those, obviously in observance of those who gave their life to our country, of course, and also as it's become kind of tradition and custom in America for a long weekend to kind of kick off the summer. And so for the people who work hard to put our show on the air each and every day, giving them some time to enjoy that with family and friends, we want to do that. So no show for us of any kind there on Monday. Then on Tuesday, I'm going to begin a little time away from work for the next 4 days, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday. We have some just traditional kind of pre-recorded shows we're going to air for that. We worked really hard to put those together. I think you're going to really enjoy those. We've got some other stuff coming up later on this summer. We're actually going to do something a little bit different that we've never really done before for DawgNation Daily. We'll tell you more about that at that point in time, but a little schedule reminder, regular show as always tomorrow, no show at all on Memorial Day Monday. Then some fun pre-recorded shows airing Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, Friday as I sort of step back and take a little time with my family here. Looking forward to doing that coming up next week. Now, speaking of great vacations, no better vacation for you to take, we don't think, than a Royal Caribbean cruise vacation. And that's what we're all about here as we go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. And by the way, there's massive demand out there right now for these Royal Caribbean cruise ships. And I'm not just saying that, it's true. So much so that the Royal Caribbean's going to keep delivering these new ships to keep up with the unprecedented level of demand that exists for their product and service here right now. And the latest example of that is Utopia of the Seas. And the shipbuilding process to me is fascinating because, A, I just think it's amazing that people build things. It's always good to build stuff. And to build these gigantic ships is just amazing. And, of course, when you think about, and if you're watching a video, you see all of this, the ships themselves are like floating cities, but the actual, it's still a ship, right? It still functions like a ship. You get all the same thing that ships have. This ship has to have too. But you also have the entertainment part of this, like the aqua theater or like the pool decks and things like that. And, Utopia of the Seas is finished and it's ready to sail. And so it's been in France for a couple of days, kind of doing some test sailings, making sure everything's working the way it's supposed to. And it's on its way to Port Canaveral there, too. And what an experience it's going to be when it gets there. I get a chance to be among the first to sail on it coming up in July. You can get your own opportunity on that there as well. Jessica Slater, a travel professional, good to help you out with all of that. You can give her a call, 770-718-9147. That's 770-718-9147. You can also email her, jslater@dreamvacations.com for a lot more on that. All right, let's go cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean here today. Kind of a television theme to some of our stories here for this. Didn't necessarily plan it that way, but that's what it's going to turn out to be. I want to begin with this. I just sort of think this is funny for a couple of reasons. First of all, Florida State can't stop talking about being, what in their view, snubbed from last year's playoff. But the latest complaint about that's perhaps the most humorous. Florida State Athletic Director Michael Alford was talking about when he knew that they weren't going to make the playoff, and he said he knew the day the show came on the air, that Sunday when it was announced. I think this is really funny. And I don't know the guy that he's talking about here. I just think it's, just funny. He says, when I kind of knew when it hit me walking to the bus out of the locker room with some players, The conversation between the two of them was one of them saying, we're not going. The other one saying, what are you talking about? This is coming from an interview on Sirius XM radio. And this player says, he says, follow the money. We're not going to be in. Alabama won. We're not going. And then he says, when he saw that in Tallahassee the next day, do you know the ESPN reporter named Harry Lyles Jr.? I don't have an opinion of Lyles one way or another, but apparently Alford thinks that's the B team because when he saw that Lyles was in Tallahassee and Marty Smith, who's probably a little bit more famous, a little bit more well-known, when he was in Tuscaloosa, from the perspective of Alford, he's like, well, there you go. The fix is in. They're sending the JV reporter to our program. Marty Smith's going to Tuscaloosa. That lets me know that Florida State's getting in. As I said before, I don't have beef with Lyles. I don't have an opinion of him one way or another. He doesn't really register with me all that much, and I guess that's the point that Alford's making here is when they sent the non-famous reporter to cover Florida State, that was the tip-off to him that Florida State was not going to the playoff. I find that to be a little bit funny, especially in light of the fact that Florida State, including its administration here and its coach, Mike Norvell, they just can't stop talking about that, which is, I guess, pretty funny in its own right. Speaking of the college football playoff, we learned information yesterday about how these games are going to be televised. And when it was recently announced a few months ago that ESPN was signing a long-term contract to be the television provider for the college football playoff, one of the clauses in the contract, and we talked about this at the time, was they had the opportunity to option their rights, essentially sublease these games to another network. Well, we found out this week they're going to do that, and the network they're going to do that with is TNT Sports, obviously owned by the Turner family. So they're going to get a chance to broadcast 16 college football playoff games over the next 5 years. Starting off with, that's a couple of first-round games, and eventually kind of graduates, and I believe it starts in 2026, one of these quarterfinal games. So it's been kind of a weird year for sports on TV, or weird week for sports on TV, in that we found out this week that coming up within the next year, TNT is going to no longer televise NBA games, and like the, Ernie and Kenny and Charles and Shaq show that's done the NBA for such a long time is not going to be doing that after next season. So TNT kind of getting out of the NBA business, a sport they have owned for a long time, and getting into the college football business. Now, I would say I believe this is probably a net positive for college football overall. It will admittedly be weird to watch one of these big games on a different network because we've gotten so used to these games being on ESPN. It'll be a little bit strange, but also probably good for the sport. I think having additional voices involved with the sport are probably a good thing. For instance, I don't like the Big Ten, but I do like the Big Ten kind of has NBC and primarily Fox and to a certain degree CBS involved in what they're doing. I just think having a greater media presence than just ESPN kind of helps college football, perhaps innovation for the future and things like that. And for the most part, I think the TNT and Turner Sports in general does a really good job of the sports. I think they've been good for Major League Baseball. I think they do a pretty good job with that. I think they've been very good for the NCAA tournament. They've owned the NBA better than anybody could ever hope to. And I think they'll probably be pretty good at college football there as well. What the broadcast will look like, we don't really know. Some are saying, well, what if Kenny and Shaq and Charles, they just talk college football? I'd have no problem with that. And obviously Ernie Johnson is a potential host as a UGA grad. So maybe ESPN not exactly wanting to put Georgia guys on the air in kind of the post-David Pollock era. Maybe eventually we'll have TNT putting Ernie Johnson on the air, perhaps showing a little love to George in the process. And speaking of ESPN, one final story here. This week, Pat McAfee had Kirk Herbstreit on his show. They were talking about McAfee's future on ESPN College GameDay. Apparently, he's got a contract that's up, and they're, I guess, in the process of negotiation. And McAfee was talking about the possibility that it might get worked out, but essentially leaving the door open that his time on GameDay could come to an end. I think this is all really weird. I mean, obviously, McAfee is a huge media phenomenon. No one can deny that. And I'm not anti-McAfee in terms of the space that he typically lives in. I've said before, I don't love him on ESPN's College GameDay because what McAfee is good at, that's not really what I want GameDay to be. You've also got the issue where McAfee sort of feuded with Georgia fans a little bit, and obviously I think that's pretty dumb. And I don't fault Georgia fans if they decide they don't like McAfee on the basis of some of what he's done on GameDay as it relates to them. But I would say bigger than all of that, the other thing that kind of comes to mind here is that ESPN GameDay is trying to be the flagship college football show. we just talked about inside the NBA. You know, how many years now has it been Shaq and Kenny and Charles and Ernie? And prior to Shaq joining the show, it was the other three forever. I mean, that show has been a staple because of the consistency of the broadcast team. Well, if Game Day kind of moves heaven and earth to bring McAfee in, and then 1 year later he's back off again, like that's a level of instability that a flagship show just doesn't need to have. And so I have to admit, I do kind of wonder in kind of the changing landscape of college football, like what does, where does Game Day fit into all of this? I think that Nick Saban's going to probably be pretty good on the show. I'm expecting Saban to be pretty good on TV. The reviews he drew for the NFL draft were almost overwhelmingly and universally positive. So adding Saban probably makes the show better in the eyes of most people. But if you're like bringing in McAfee with a whole bunch of fanfare, and now it's not sure if you're bringing him back again the next year, like at a certain point in time, that's not enough stability for a program that's supposed to be as important as College Game Day once was viewed to be. Will it maintain some of that into the future? I think it still remains to be seen there on that. So a potential shakeup, I guess, coming, although it seems like there's also a pretty good chance that McAfee ends up re-signing on this show and being a part of it moving into the future. But still, weird to even be having this conversation 1 year after all the major change that was made to that show, and obviously most of us just miss David Pollack. We'll make that cruising around the SEC, courtesy of Royal Caribbean. So as we wrap up here today, I'm going to do something that I don't normally do for our Golden Shoe. We don't really put people on blast, things like that. I think that's kind of dumb. But the other thing I also think is dumb are like old school, like 90s mentality. Remember like the old days of like Fulmer Cup and, counting arrests and, all this sort of heavy-handed coverage of, players who sort of step out of bounds. Well, rival fans always just, they never seem to stop wanting to do that kind of stuff. And I just think it's dumb. And so there was an example when Scovie White had his minor infraction, essentially driving error that kind of, got turned into whatever. A Florida account with a fairly sizable following was like, UGA, University of Getting Arrested. And I guess sort of, low IQ folks perhaps think that's humorous. Well, what is it? 1 day later, you've got in a situation involving a Florida player. It's 2 nights in jail for hitting a driver and then fleeing deputies at 150 miles an hour. So just be careful what you say out there. I guess that's the only thing I'll say about that. And we'll point that out there. Just be careful in terms of what you choose to sort of point fingers at. By the way, speaking of the lousy, stinking Gators, about 1,293 days. That's how long it's been since Florida has beaten Georgia. That is our Gator Hater Updater. We certainly love that. We'll see all of you back here tomorrow. DawgNation Daily, presented by Merriweather and Tharp. See you then, everybody. And on video, time now for the R.S. Andrews Cool Down. R.S. Andrews, when you turn to for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price that's promised. That is what they are all about. And we are all about taking your comments. And so we'll do that here right now across Facebook and YouTube and DawgNation.com. I'll start on DawgNation.com here for a moment and see what Randy Hall says. How about a T-shirt for Florida State that says they went from snubbed to drubbed, which is kind of funny. Obviously, a reference to missing the playoff and then getting beaten by 10 touchdowns by Georgia in the Orange Bowl. That's pretty funny. Silver Britches says that Pat McAfee is annoying. Yeah, listen, I think the shtick that he does for his own show probably works pretty well. It's not really a show that I watch very much, but I don't deny, like McAfee on wrestling. Like a couple of years ago when he came out at WrestleMania, this has been more than a couple of years ago now, like he got the biggest pop of anybody at the entire event. Like it was obvious that McAfee was very, very popular, very, very popular. Like I said, I'm not going to be a regular viewer to that. It's just not that interesting to me. But it's obvious that he's very good at what he does in that space. But being good at what McAfee's good at, I just don't know how well it works for College Game Day. I like Game Day sort of feeling like the show of record. And I don't know that that kind of like over-caffeinated shtick necessarily works for that. But we'll see. Silver Britches also says that ESPN screwed up by letting Pollack go. What were they thinking? Dude knows more about football than any of them on there. Yeah, I think his presence is missed. I do. I think his presence is missed. I really do. DT also mentioning the House lawsuit, which is, I think, coming to a settlement. I believe that's being voted on yesterday and kind of, I guess, in conclusion today, big dollars being paid out. We're led to believe that Georgia's probably in an okay spot on this in terms of its ability to kind of absorb these costs, but they are massive costs nonetheless. Massive, massive costs coming up here on that. All right, let's see what's going on YouTube here for a moment. Let's see what else is going on. I can't tell quite what's going on in here. Jay Shipe says it's Thursday and it's still no YouTube start. Is that really true? I know I started on Facebook yesterday, but have I not started on YouTube? And see, everybody else says I spend too much time on YouTube. So ultimately, the takeaway here is I just can't win. Apparently, it might be a troll or something in here, which is always bad because, A, I mean, to me, trolls are fairly easy to ignore because I spend most of my life doing that. But B, when people get in there and they respond to the troll, well, now it becomes harder for me to find comments to read because everybody's sort of responding back to. Some of y'all do the same thing with G. Grace, too, and I don't think of G. Grace as a troll. But when y'all get worked up by somebody, now I'm having a hard time finding comments to read. Paul Moon says he's not worried about Ohio State beaten by mid-Michigan teams back-to-back years. They're getting number one love because they're Ohio State, and ESPN doesn't need a reason to gush over them. Yeah, perhaps that's some of it. I also think that the last couple of years, we've seen sort of an NBA-ification of college football. The NBA has become a sport where, for the most part, the off-season is more interesting than the in-season. People love off-season NBA drama. They just love it. And as that's become more prominent, people kind of fixate on that more so than the actual games themselves. And I do think there's a certain, and this is probably incentivized, a certain faction of the media that likes turning college football in kind of sort of an off-season sport. Now, we've always done the show, we've never had a hard time finding things to talk about. But there are some people, I think, that like the idea of what if we create the sort of off-season soap opera around college football that exists around, the NBA. And I think that's when you have a team like Ohio State that kind of emerges during that, that I guess, desire. Well, then, they are going to get that sort of rock star love and that sort of rock star treatment. Frank Patterson, along the same line, says, I can't take a team serious that hasn't beaten their rival in 3 years. Well, it is a fair point that Ohio State has a good bit to prove before it even gets the privilege of measuring itself against Georgia. I believe you're absolutely right about that. Chris Hayes says, name a player that we're not talking about enough right now that will be in the spotlight in the fall. That's a really good question. I would say a good answer to that question, it might be a guy like Jamal Jarrett, a guy that, because the one thing that Georgia needs, it needs to be better against the run. And obviously one of the best ways to do that is just to have more beef up front. And if a guy like Jarrett really is kind of grown into his body and mature, what he does in the interior of the defensive line, potentially taking on multiple blockers and sort of occupying those gaps, what he does there creates a chance for you to shift more bodies other places. Georgia's issue last year is more outside runs, but part of the reason that's an issue is because you're having to put bodies more towards the interior of the defense because you just don't quite have that big space eater like what Jordan Davis once was. So if a guy like Jarrett emerges, that's the kind of thing that could have reverberations across the entirety of the Georgia defense, I believe. Darian Ford says, do you think the new video will move our recruiting a level up? You mean the new video game? We're actually going to talk about that next week. I do think there's a couple of ways in which Georgia will be portrayed in this game that I do think could have a benefit for recruiting. Paul Moon also mentions Anthony Evans. Yeah, I feel like Evans has been talked about a decent amount, but that's a guy that I do think is vying for some real playing time this year. I do. And anytime we have this discussion of, hey, who's off the radar for Georgia, as you've perhaps heard me say in the past, one of the trickiest parts of that is sort of identifying a player who actually qualifies as off the radar, because we talk about this stuff so much, and Georgia fans in their own lives together talk about this stuff so much, that eventually it kind of becomes hard to find somebody who's not generating a lot of conversation. So you can decide for yourself where Evans kind of fits on that, but certainly someone who I think could be, in line for something. And by the way, JC sort of touching on that too, saying when it comes to off-the-radar guys, it's hard to tell because Georgia has a very big radar. That is indeed the case. Paul Moon also says something funny here. He says Ohio State fans are propping up Michigan to put Georgia down. That's next-level mental gymnastics, which is pretty funny. Bill Shirley says, I can't hardly wait for the NCAA college football game. Yeah, so, and I think eventually I'm going to have a meeting with some of our people about this. So I sort of want to do something with the game, but I don't really know what that'll be because for me, like, I'm not a game player. I'm not a gamer. So it's not like I'm going to just do like Twitch stream and have everybody tune in to watch me play the game. Y'all would have to tell me how to play the game, right? It's like you have to tell me how to turn the console on. Now I'm going to get the game because I know I want to play it with my son. So I'm not really like a gamer expert. So no one's going to want to watch me play. But I do believe everyone's going to do something with the game. But I think we need to try to do something with the game. But I don't quite know what that is because I'm not really a gamer. And like here's the one thing that I've learned is like you got to be what you are in life. You can't try to be something that you're not. And so I'm not going to be like, hey, tune in at 9 p.m. on Twitch and, watch me play season 4 of my Dynasty mode. Like that is not going to happen. I mean, maybe we may do that just for the humor of me trying to figure out how to, actually play the game. But we need to do something with the game. I don't know what that is. We need to figure out something with the game. I don't know if it's like a tournament amongst y'all, or what. We need to do something with the game. We got to figure that out. I think that could be fun. Yeah, we could do that. Yeah, Jay was saying we could do like create a player and kind of based on some of our opinions and make me a 55. Hopefully I can be better than that. And by the way, speaking of that, yesterday we were talking about this for a moment. What Jay just said kind of makes me think about this. We were talking about my athletic ability, kind of where that stands, as a person in my 40s. I was kind of thinking about this. So, because I was talking about how I'm not quite so sure I could play pickup basketball anymore. But it did occur to me, and many of you have a similar story, that every pickup game I've ever played in, or at least a good number of them, had the sort of old man doing good old man moves. And it kind of got me thinking, could I become the old man with old man moves and be like, how like if you like golf, there's a lot of ringers on the PGA Tour champions now, what we think of as the senior tour. Like a lot of guys who win on the senior tour were not winners on the PGA Tour. They were like buying their time and sort of waiting for 50, and they just go to the senior tour and just light the thing on fire because they've been like trying to become the best 50-year-old player. There's a lot of ringers on the seniors tour. You may not realize that, but there are. I sort of started thinking to myself, it's like, could I like just start training now for the next few years, and then when I'm 50, like I'm the best athlete of like the over 50 set? I feel like there may be something there. Like if I'm like, because I'm roughly the same age, I think, as Tom Brady. I guess he's a little older than me. So like, if you're sort of measuring me against like current contemporary athletes, I probably don't fare very well. I don't have the same doctors that Tom Brady has. Let me just put it that way. But if you start comparing me to people who are like 60, well, at that point in time, I'm probably doing okay. Although we saw Richard Childress this week threaten to beat up Ricky Stenhouse, so you got to be careful who you say that about. All right, let's go. Jonathan Aaron says, I called myself a fat slob yesterday, which I did do. He says, I would say swimming is the cheat code, but we all know you can't swim. I swim well enough to avoid drowning. This is a long-time joke in the chat section, this thought that I can't swim. I swim well enough to avoid drowning. But if you ever tried to swim for exercise, you do realize pretty quickly that actual swimming is way harder than the sort of like dog paddle style thing that I typically do. The actual swimming where you have to stay in a lane and like they keep their face down the whole time, that's much more difficult than you sometimes realize. All right, let me go to Facebook here for a moment. We'll take a few comments. We're going to bounce out of there after that. Chris Slim White says, no, BA, leave that alone. We need our show. We can't have you on injury reserve. I mean, I feel like if I had to, I'd do the show like, remember Hugh Freeze when he was the Liberty coach? He coach in a hospital bed. I feel like if I had to be like a hospital bed and just put the mic up to my face, I feel like I could probably still get the show done. I could probably still do that. Eric Triggerstad says, I really hope Ohio State gets the preseason number 1 ranking. I think the thing is a curse. How many times has the preseason number 1 won it all? Yeah, probably not a ton. Not a lot of wire-to-wire winners, I don't think. But Georgia's going to be preseason number 1. I mean, all of the talk about the rockstar Buckeyes and all this kind of stuff, like that's all being done at kind of the unofficial level. I don't think there's any chance whatsoever Georgia's not the preseason number 1 team. And my guess is they'll be by a fairly wide margin. I get what you're saying. It's like sometimes it's sort of more fun to be like 2 or 3. We've seen Georgia come from number 3 a couple of times to win national championships. But this year, Georgia, I believe, will have a fairly sizable lead as the preseason number 1 team. Tennille Calvino says maybe for the over 50 crowd, I'll be a great swimmer. Now, I know that's not true because you go to like some of these like pools where like real swimming's taking place. Some of the older folks, they're out there killing it, man. So I know that's not the case. Chris Slim White says, which freshman do you think has the biggest impact? I believe it's probably Ellis Robinson. I think that Robinson's going to end up playing a pretty good bit. I would say that Nate Frazier's a good name on that list because – so let me do a top 5 in order, and I'm sure I'm going to probably get some of this wrong. I'd go Robinson 1. I think I'd go Frazier 2. I believe I'd go KJ 3. I believe I might go Joseph Jonah Ajonye 4 because I do think he's going to play some defensive end. I do, and I think he's going to probably be pretty good when he does. I'll tell you to watch out for, and some of this is only going to be true if injuries occur, but typically speaking, injuries do occur. I tell you who you may be really happy to have this year. That's Daniel Calhoun. I think that Calhoun right now is probably Georgia's number 8 offensive lineman. And most teams do not have 8 offensive linemen they really would trust putting into a game. But Calhoun's emergence as a guy that if you had to play him at guard this year, or maybe at tackle, but probably at guard, if you had to play him at guard this year, you'd feel okay about putting him in. That's the sort of – go back to Ohio State. Ohio State does not have 8 offensive linemen they feel really good about. But if Georgia does, that is that's an example of the overall depth they have. And a guy like Calhoun maybe doesn't play very much. In a roundabout way, I guess you probably hope that he doesn't, at least in terms of significant snaps, because you're probably talking about injury if that's the case. But that's one of those freshmen that I think is probably in a pretty good spot here, Georgia. Marshall Fleming mentioning the fact that for everything that Ohio State probably does have, still unknown at quarterback. And, y'all, I think that's real. Now, that doesn't mean they won't have a good one because sometimes you just sort of put everybody out there and you sort of hope somebody emerges from the group. But, I mean, some of the stuff we saw from Devin Brown this spring was sort of evidence why he never transferred because there may not be, anywhere for him to really go. And, you think about Julian Sayin, and Sayin's probably a pretty bright prospect overall, but Alabama essentially turned him loose. I mean, Alabama was happy to let Sayin go because they feel like Austin Mack's going to be their future. So is Ohio State's savior at quarterback really going to be a guy that, I'm not saying Alabama processed him out of the program, but they didn't seem to be shedding tears when he left. Like, is that really the savior for Ohio State at quarterback? Obviously, the most likely starter is Will Howard, the guy that came from Kansas State. But, y'all, do your own research. Look at Howard's numbers. Like, I mean, it's not obvious to me that Howard's better than Kyle McCord. It's just not. Now, what we say about a guy like Trevor Etienne is he'll be a better player at Georgia than he was at Florida because of what he has around him. Maybe in the case of Howard, the same thing will be true too. I mean, it is entirely possible that is the case. But, this idea that they went out and swung for the fences, oh, dude, we got Howard, forget about it. On this supposed rock star team, Will Howard is not a rock star. Will Howard is a guy that was at Kansas State that nobody really knows anything about. Jerry Popham, very funny stuff from him. All right, one more trip around the various comments. Let's go back to YouTube here. G. Gray says Ohio State's writing checks for Bama guys, obviously for Downs and for Sayin. Paul Moon says, yeah, Howard isn't any better than McCord, and they wanted McCord gone by game 2. Yeah, what Paul's touching on here is that if you really want to know what's going on, sometimes listening to other fans is appropriate. Now, sometimes these sort of obnoxious fans that kind of get into our sort of field of vision, they kind of get on your nerves maybe a little bit. But if you listen to the thing that fans say to each other about their favorite team, there is information to be gleaned from that. That's one of the reasons why I'm always going to these opposing team message boards and things like that, because honestly, if you give me 100 good Ohio State fans having a conversation back and forth with each other, I'll take the received wisdom of that crowd and put as much faith in that as anything one of their, what we think of as sort of blue check reporters. You give me a room full of Ohio State fans having a knowledgeable conversation, I'll take the consensus of that talk as much as I'll take anything one of the main reporters is saying. I just will. And it has been so fascinating to watch Ohio State fans kind of talk themselves into and then talk themselves out of quarterbacks now forever. It was Kyle McCord last fall, and Paul said they turned on him so fast. And then this spring, it's Devin Brown. Wait till you see this guy. He's like 30 years old. He's been there forever. Wait till y'all see Devin Brown. And then by the spring game, they didn't want to see another thing from him ever again. So there you go. Let's see what else. Bubby D. Oh, good to see Bubby in the comment section. Good to see Christy. Talk about all-time legends in here. You got Bubby and Christy. Good to see them here. Good to see them there. DMart42 says they're about to be talking about Ohio State being like the Falcons, paying Howard $1 million to ride the pine for Julian Sayin, who isn't ready. Yeah, I wonder if it's $1 million. We talked this the other day. There's a good piece at CBSSports.com about what the actual going rate for some of this stuff is. Maybe not always as high as you might think that it is. But clearly they spent some money, and this has been a very big year of expenditures for Ohio State. Weird to think that, all of this is like at positions other than the quarterback spot. But maybe a guy like Howard ends up being okay. All right, let me go back over to DawgNation.com again. Lee Burkett, by the way, going out to the sort of, under the radar type guy, he mentions Jordan Hall. I think that Jordan Hall could be in for a big season. Once again, I don't know that would have classified for me as under the radar because I think people are expecting that from Hall. But I certainly agree with your overall point that that's a player that, Georgia probably needs to see sort of take that next step and has a very strong chance of doing that. Silver Britches says that Texas fans are saying they don't want any of their fans chanting SEC, SEC. I'm sort of with them on this, that I'm done with that. Like when I was younger, I kind of liked the SEC chant. I did. I just sort of thought it was like, I just sort of liked it. I don't know. But I'm not into that at all anymore. I'm just not. And, maybe if I had to go back and do it all over again, liking the SEC chant, maybe I was wrong for liking it then. But at one point in time, I sort of grew up in like a 90s era of pro wrestling back in like the days of ECW. Something about SEC sort of felt like that to me, and so maybe that's why I liked it. But having a little bit of regional pride, I think, makes some sense. The SEC is always sort of represented where we come from. And so I've always liked that. But I feel no kinship with Texas, not whatsoever. I don't feel any kinship with Texas. I don't feel any kinship with Missouri. These non-Southeastern teams that now populate the SEC, this is a group of institutions with like shared economic interest now, and that's just not interesting to me. So I'm getting very close to saying whatever sense of SEC pride I once had is totally gone. I'm getting very close to saying that SEC pride no longer exists. And I over the course of my time have had a ton of SEC pride, and I still think it's the most interesting league, and the teams in the SEC are the most interesting teams. I am still signed up for all the entertainment, but this notion that it just means more, I don't know that it just means more anymore. I really don't. I really don't know that it just means more anymore. So I'm sort of with Texas fans on that. This is now, an economic arrangement, and nobody roots for balance sheets. Let's see what else. DT says he was a Red Cross certified lifeguard, even worked one summer at an apartment complex pool. So there you go. Seems like it'd probably be a pretty good job. Kevin Chapman agreed with me on that. Ooh, Chris Lim White gives you Troy Bowles, and that's under the radar. So now, will he be the guy that explodes? We'll see. But Troy Bowles counts as being under the radar because the attention gets paid to CJ and to Raylan Wilson with good reason. By the way, ESPN loves Raylan Wilson. They've written about him twice this offseason, which is kind of interesting. But those are the guys that get all that attention. So if you want someone who would fit the description of being under the radar, Troy Bowles would. Troy Bowles would. Marshall Fleming says Nazir Stackhouse is going to have a great year. I'd love for that to be the case. He says he's much better than most fans know. He was forced to play almost the whole game because no depth behind him. He played twice the amount of snaps. This is really important that, sometimes it's a little bit hard to measure, because, stats are just sort of counted differently for a defensive lineman. The point he's making about Stackhouse and the overall snaps that he's played, by the way, including on a national championship team in 2022, the snap count for Stackhouse probably does tell the story. I think that Marshall is making a great point there on that, is that it's sort of like the pitcher that has a lot of innings pitched, that you're not being trusted to pitch a lot of innings unless they think you're a really good pitcher. The fact that Stackhouse is always on the field tells you what Georgia thinks about him, and Georgia's pretty good at evaluating talent. I think you're absolutely right. Wayne Kirkland, kind of furthering the point about the lack of SEC pride, saying the SEC championship game now means nothing. It's just a trap game to give one of the two teams an extra L. Maybe that's the case. I think there's a chance what you're saying is true. I also kind of wonder, the basketball committee doesn't even watch the conference tournaments unless there's an automatic bid that's stolen from one of them. I almost wonder if the committee even watches the conference championship games now. Like, how much do we really see change from a seeding standpoint because of the conference championship? In the past, we've only had 4 teams in the playoffs, so conference title games have meant a lot in most years. But one way or another, that's about to really change. And, for all the things that are about to occur that I do like, I think the new schedule is going to be pretty fun. I am going to miss the SEC championship because I would say over the course of the last, in my sort of SEC pride heyday, the SEC championship football game was my single favorite sporting event. I loved it more than anything. So much fun. So much fun. As prestigious to me almost as winning the national championship. It's just such a cool deal. And it seems like that's likely to change, which is tough. All right, we're going to go for now. Y'all, thanks for being here. Fun show for us tomorrow. Popping out of here after that to sort of go off the grid for a few days. Looking forward to that. Everybody deserves that. Hope you get your own chance to do that some here this summer there as well. So, we'll see you then for that. But for now, R.S. Andrews brings the R.S. Andrews cool down to you. Find them online, rsandrews.com, for your air conditioning, heating, plumbing, and electric needs. They show up on time. They do the work that's promised, the price is promised. Think about this. If out of nowhere you kind of realize, oh my gosh, I'm taking cold showers, the water heaters on the fritz, whatever. Well, don't forget, in an emergency situation like that, R.S. Andrews might be able to replace that water heater for you the same day. That's what R.S. Andrews is all about. So make sure you find them online at rsandrews.com. We will talk to you then tomorrow. DawgNation Daily presented by Meriwether and Tharp. The R.S. Andrews cool down after that. See you then, everybody.